So to say that you are effectively unvaccinated until you've developed your full immunity from the vaccine is an absurdity, because in some sense, what you really want to know is, did this injection make me less likely to get COVID? If it increases your likelihood for a couple of weeks and then decreases it for, a couple of
3 months.
months, you're looking for the net impact on my likelihood of contracting the disease. You're not looking for, after the thing had finally done its work, if it reduced it, and going to ignore everything else.
Yes.
So anyway, that's an absurdity, but that's not what Fenton and Neil are claiming here. What they find is that there is a appalling mathematical sleight of hand built in here, right? Where if you test not the vaccine against a placebo, right? So you have vaccinated and unvaccinated, but you test a placebo against itself, right? And you use the same protocol where you take anybody who develops the disease within the first 2 weeks after they've been injected with the placebo, you treat them as unvaccinated, and you treat people who come down with the disease after the 2 weeks as vaccinated. What happens is you create a mathematical artifact in which the vaccine looks highly effective. If you use the 2-week cutoff period, it looks to be about 83% effective. So that turns out to be true irrespective of the population size that you use and irrespective of the infectiousness of the disease in question. It's just a simple mathematical artifact that comes from taking people who did come down with the disease and forcing them into the category unvaccinated, and then comparing the unvaccinated to the vaccinated.
There's no placebos being taken. The argument is there is no way to tell from what was actually done if the vaccine is better than placebo. And in fact, what we see is when you run the numbers as if it was a placebo, you get exactly the same supposed efficacy as you do when you actually look at what the vaccine rates were. And this is due to this, again, this, maybe intentional, maybe not, sleight of hand with regard to moving for the first 2 weeks after you've been vaccinated. If you're in one of these trials, you are categorized. If you come down with COVID in those first 2 weeks, you're categorized as an unvaccinated COVID case. And that actually creates exactly this graph that Zach is showing here, where early on it appears that those who have been vaccinated have a very low rate of COVID in the beginning. And it appears that those who are unvaccinated, why would that change at all? In fact, right? Like if you've had nothing done to you, why would your rates be changing? Especially if you assume basically a background rate of 2% or 1% or 5% infections, which are all the the numbers that he runs through. But what you see is actually those numbers approach one another. The number of COVID cases for unvaccinated people and the number of COVID cases for vaccinated people approach one another very quickly. And if you take out the mathematical sleight of hand, basically all of the evidence of efficacy begins to fall apart.
If you generate the impression of efficacy with this either error or more likely trick, if you do that, you generate very high efficacy at the beginning. In fact, again, if we have no functional vaccine involved at all, with a 2-week cutoff, you get 83% plus efficacy. And if you use a 3-week cutoff, as was apparently done by the British, you get something above 90%.
Yeah, close to 100.
But what happens is that efficacy drops off because it's an artifact of what you got in the first phase, while people who were supposedly in this period where they're developing immunity differ radically because you keep shoving the ones who got sick into the unvaccinated group, right? So what that means is you get the impression of a very effective vaccine that unfortunately requires regular boosting, right? Which I would point out, as Fenton and Neil imply, that is exactly what the companies that produce these things would ideally want. The impression that what they've got is a very good treatment or a medication that requires constant boosting, right? That's almost ideal from the perspective of pharma. So Anyway, I thought it was very interesting for a decent college class on statistics, for example, right? How do you generate the impression? How can statistics artificially generate the impression of a highly effective treatment for something when there is no effectiveness because, in fact, what you tested is a placebo? Well, this would be a very good way to train people to realize that actually you can't just look at an efficacy number like this and read anything important into it, because you have to make sure that it wasn't just a simple artifact of how you structured the experiment. Now, the question, though, and this is a question that has another dimension, is, okay, it's subtle enough that you and I, in talking about this very particular flaw, didn't spot it. Okay?
Yeah.
Right? So...
No, and I mean, I think looking through the article, it took me a few times to carefully go through what he is doing to kind of like, okay.
It is a readily comprehensible error. It is also an error that one could structure around if that was your intent.
Yes.
Right? You could simply start the clock at the 2-week mark, and you could throw out anything that had happened beforehand without shuttling anybody, right?
Yeah.
And then you could figure out how effective these things were. And if, in the case of a placebo, you would see no effectiveness, right? You wouldn't get the artifact from this initial, shoving of people from one category to the other. But here's the point. This error is subtle at first and then glaring once you see it. What is the explanation for this not resulting in a massive mea culpa, a refactoring of the claims of efficacy for the vaccines? In other words, what has been unearthed here, if we are to believe that they didn't know what they were doing and they just screwed this up because statistics are, easy to mess up, then the point is the natural follow-on would be a whole lot of, well, who did screw this up and how did it get through the various kinds of review and the regulators and all of this? And the absence of that is what tells you something here is wildly amiss. This is having to be worked out by, professor of risk Norman Fenton on his Substack in order for it to reach enough people to matter, right? Via Dark Horse and then who knows what else. But the point is we are being forced to do the work in the places that do not seem like the right place for the work, because the work is not being done in the places that do seem like the right place for the work. And that haunts every one of these discussions, right? Why is it happening on the Joe Rogan Experience? Because it's not happening elsewhere.
My programs, when we were professors, when I was a professor, by saying, what is science? Let's talk that through. And what does a scientist look like? What do scientists have? And, I'd have a slide, be like, oh, a scientist definitely has an advanced degree and probably wears a lab coat and has a lot of fancy glassware, expensive instrumentation, and definitely some big grants, hopefully from the NSF or NIH, depending on, what kind of research they're doing. And like, no, you don't need any of that, right? And in fact, increasingly, the more of those things you have, maybe the more likely that you're actually not doing any science at all.
We all have an impression of science because we all know that we are standing on a huge accumulated bed of wisdom produced by this method that has made us into the modern creatures that we are and has provided tremendous benefits and insights, and we feel enlightened, right? That is what happens when science is done properly. But it is the flip side of another coin. Science is so capable, and because of the things that make it capable, it is also extremely fragile, right? It is so easy to do something that is scientific looking in every regard, screw it up in one place, and come up with the inverse of the right answer for lots of reasons, because science is done on the honor system, because it assumes that what you're trying to do is be right in the long run rather than get tenure or something like this.
Yeah, it seems you're seeking truth rather than self-adulation. In a world where your medical practitioners insist on referring to women about to give birth as birthing people, that's not going to be a place where you can go to and expect to hear hard truths. It's not gonna. You already know you're being lied to, and I don't know whose feelings exactly they're protecting. I mean, I kind of do, but why are anyone's feelings being protected over the seeking of truth and the revealing of reality? Sometimes it's going to be ugly. Often it's not. But regardless, that's what we are trying to do.
Yep. In the interest of just wrapping it up, if you take people who come down with the disease during this period in which they might be developing full immunity, if they'd actually been injected with something that would do that, and you shove them into the unvaccinated category because they have not yet reached that endpoint, what you are doing is defining them as unvaccinated, right? They are unvaccinated by definition. You're taking sick people who landed in the sick category, and most of the people in the study never end up in the sick category. You're taking people who ended up in the sick category at the beginning of the test period, and you are making them unvaccinated by definition. You're talking about people who you did vaccinate, right? And then you are shoving them into the other category because they became sick. So this is a semantic nuance, but the point is, it is their having gotten sick that caused you to graft them on to the unvaccinated category, which is cheating, right? So anyway, it is an egregious breach of the scientific integrity here. And if it's accidental, then it should have resulted in a whole lot of backpedaling and searching for how such an error could have got so far into the literature, right? And the fact, right, and reanalysis, which then should have us, we should be having congressional hearings about these vaccines and what effect they actually did have, both positive and negative. And the point is, we see no instinct in that direction among the people responsible.
Yeah. Really simply, so it's clear what you're saying.
Sure.
I think the point you're trying to make, or to reveal that Norman made, is that it is assumed, I think anyone who looks at those statistics before you see the error assumes, okay, if they say 2 weeks down the road is when you count as vaccinated, that's the point at which they start
the clock.
Instead, they've artificially extended the clock by an extra 2 weeks for you to be able to get sick if you're unvaccinated, and shortened it by 2 weeks for if you are vaccinated. And so it's just if you are taking data over 8 weeks, it's actually 12 weeks and 4 weeks or 10 and 4 respective, or 10 and 6 respectively. And so it's just 2 different clocks.